I'm Ann Elgood. I'm the executive director here at ICLA, and I agreed to moderate this panel before I was aware that there were 6 panelists. So that was a mistake. Always get the details before you agree to anything. But I will do the least talking up here tonight. But I just want to say that I hope you've seen Will's absolutely phenomenal, extraordinary exhibition, and we're able also to see at least one of the live performances at REDCAT. Thank you to Katy. Where's Katy? Right here, to my left. Our partner in the production of that. And we're just so really honored to have this exhibition here. And it's just an extraordinary work. So we're going to talk about that work tonight in varying amounts of detail, both pragmatic, practical, and aesthetic and creative. And what we're going to do is, you have everyone's bios in your, of course, green printed program. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of those details, but what we're going to do is we're going to start off and have each of these curators who have all worked with Will on the siccer project, and they're going to all talk about their experiences of this work. This has been a project that's been happening over many, many years, I think at least 8, if not more, now, Will. And you'll hear some of the things that make that truly extraordinary tonight. One of them being that it's the same 5 performers that work on the live performance. And over that amount of time, those of you who work with performance or are performers know how difficult that is to get those same people together. So that's the kind of commitment that I think Will inspires in all of us. Likewise, these are curators who have changed institutions, moved across the country, whatever, probably had like kids and got married in the time of this exhibition or this project, and yet also remain totally committed to Will and to making and to presenting it in the best possible way. So the sort of theme of tonight, which is part of a series we started called A Closer Look, which we've only done one so far, but it's a series of conversations in which we bring in curatorial voices, whether they're curators or artists who have curated or others who have curated, to really break down the kind of methodologies of the work, to give you the backstage view into the organization of exhibitions. And in this case, working with performance, working with a project that's iterative, in other words, literally changes and adapts to the different space and the different context in which it's presented, that will really be the conversation tonight. So thinking about place, in terms of city, state, geographic location, thinking about size and scale of the space that you have to work with, the public programs that accompany that, who is your audience, who are you trying to bring in for the first time, for the 100th time. All of those questions, I think, will be addressed in different ways by this esteemed group of curators. So I'm going to pass it over to Lumi and Katy, who are going to tell the origin story of siccer.
Is this on? Maybe not. Yes? No? Try again. Can you hear me? Yeah? Oh, yeah. Thank you. Just took a second. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Anne and Amanda. It's such a pleasure to be here in such incredible company. I'm going to start, and then I'll pass it to Lumi. But we started in 2017, which is many, many years ago. And Will actually pulled up the email. I will say Lumi and I were both working at the kitchen. Neither of us work at the kitchen anymore. So speaking to the evolution, a lot has changed. I now work at REDCAT here in Los Angeles. Lumi is in many places all over the country doing incredible work. But at the time, I was an assistant curator and the archive manager at the kitchen. Lumi was a curator. And I had just begun to know Will. The kitchen is a really special place, just to give you some context. It's in New York City. It's one of the first alternative spaces in downtown New York, founded in 1971, and was a space that has always shown visual art as much as it's shown performance art, and has really been a space that's put the artists first. It was founded by artists. It has a tradition of curators being artists. And Lumi and I could talk about if we consider ourselves artists at another talk, but I think it has really engendered a relationship to collaboration with artists, and one that has really trusted artists. So I remember I wrote to Will after seeing his work at places like Dance Space Project, which the name may incur a relationship to dance and movement. I had also seen Will's work in gallery spaces, particularly his work with language and projection and text. And then I had also seen Will's work at Issue Project Room. And Will did a performance that I will never forget, where it was I wouldn't say anti-performance, but it was like the antithesis. So Will, I think, was always pushing at, what is performance? And this whole show was that we came in and Will was like, great, you showed up for the talkback. And we were like, wait, what? We came for the show. And the whole show was that we were at the talkback and we as audience members had to pose questions to Will. And then Will would say, oh yeah, you were wondering why the aliens came in? Well, let me tell you. And it was this kind of fantastical co-creation. So between Will's incredible movement vocabulary and facility, his use of language and real breaking down of language into its constituent parts and then rearranging those, his work with history, Will had done an incredible platform with Dance Space Project about the generation lost to HIV and AIDS and its continued legacy, which touched me super deeply and I think impacted truly the entire performing arts field. And his just real commitment to curiosity. As a young curator at the Kitchen, I was a little bit I don't quite know how this works. It was one of the first curatorial projects I ever pitched at the Kitchen. I was in much more of an assistant curator supportive space, but I was there's something about Will, I think we should do something. And so I wrote Will an email being hey, I know we've been at some parties together and I interviewed you once, maybe you want to come into the Kitchen and talk to us. And it was as broad as that. It wasn't hey, we have $10,000, we'd love for you to do 2 nights. It wasn't as specific as be in our dance and process residency program. It was really just I think you're interesting. And I sense a glimmer of possibility, and I'd love to talk with you. And so it really began there. I remember we had a meeting together at the Kitchen with Will and Lumi and I think Tim Griffin, our executive director at the time, just thinking about who is this? How can we imagine Will at the Kitchen? And then I left 2 months later. Life evolves. I got a new job in Philadelphia. And so I remember saying to Will, I was you're going to be in really great hands. Lumi, who I had brought into the project, was going to keep working with you. And Will and I stayed in touch, but it was really in Lumi's capable hands. So I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, Katy. That is such an incredible introduction to both the Kitchen as a context and your relationship to Will, and also I think what Will really meant to the New York City performing arts community. And I think, same as you, I had seen Will's work in so many different contexts, in galleries, at places like Dance Space, in online magazines like Triple Canopy. So it's I just knew that the breadth of his practice was a perfect fit for the Kitchen, but also that it might take a lot of conversations to get to the project that was going to happen. And we were very equipped for that, right? As a curatorial team, that was typically how we work with artists. It's very open-ended. So you left in 2017? Is that what happened?
I think I emailed Will in December of 2017. I think we had some meetings in early 2018, May of 2017. So and then I left in June of 2018, so a year later.
So then that, I think around 2018 is when the Kitchen had started conversations about a renovation project and a capital campaign. And that ended up kind of determining the shape and longevity of siccer in many ways, so that because we were always saying that Will's project would happen when the Kitchen space reopened to the public in 2021. That didn't happen, but so in those ensuing years, I think that this project was shaped by so many other institutions and residencies that we can continue to talk about on this panel. That Will would always kind of come back with a new idea in a different shape, but it was always the same people, right? It was really about this group of dancers, this idea of the stop motion, whether that would take the form of video or screen printing or, not just a performance and an exhibition, but also a book and an album that are forthcoming. So it was this very expansive project, but I think, something that was really shaping the thinking around it was the architecture of the kitchen and the fact that it is one of the only spaces that has a black box theater where performance happens, and then a gallery stacked on top of it, which is also a black box theater, but had a white cube built inside of it, so that any exhibition that happens in the gallery has a full, lighting grid, really great sound capabilities. It's completely light safe. People have actually used the gallery as a dark room because it used to be a film studio. So, that kind of relationship between the theater space and the gallery space was so specific. And we didn't offer these two spaces to a single artist very often. Ralph Lemon being one of the few, Will's collaborator and mentor and just everyone's favorite person. I don't know. We all love Ralph. But, we understood Will to be like the ideal artist to kind of occupy these two spaces at once, to understand the temporalities of how to have a performance during an exhibition, to build the relationships between these two spaces. But so, that being said, the kitchen is the only space that has not hosted this project as of yet. It will happen there in this fall, which is very exciting, but it was, the plan was always to premiere it at the kitchen and then for it to travel on and tour all these other incredible institutions, but it is going to do the opposite. And I think I'll leave it there, and then we can keep talking because the rest of the story will unfold as other institutions come in.
I think we should pass it on to Cynthia then, where it did premiere. And maybe one thing you could address, Cynthia, during your remarks is how the co-commissioning organizations came together, at what stage, now that we know these very early conversations. When did others start to get involved, and how did you get involved?
Well, so we did premiere the work, but I was probably, maybe except for you, later in one of the last folks to join. My predecessor, Pia Agarwal, was part of the conversation earlier, but maybe in terms of how this cohort was built, maybe someone else can speak to that.
Well, I'll just add that once it was clear that it could not premiere at the kitchen, the first institution that Will reached out to was PICA because of the very close relationship that he had with PICA.
Yes, and I think that perhaps NPN, we were trying to figure out if NPN was involved with the Creation Fund or one of those things.
Well, it was a MAP fund.
MAP fund plus Creation Fund.
Yeah.
I think what you're hearing the little threads of, and which will become evident, is that this is how work gets made. We were talking about that regardless of the institution, it's about people, it's all relational work. And so, yes, we have a long history with Will that's built on just also loving his work over many, many years, in many iterations when he was in New York, and inviting him out in 2017 for a residency program that was started to bring artists who work at the intersections of visual art and performance together from, intergenerational, and to also have artists from the region there. So I bring that up because I don't know if that's the exact year you met Keon or Holland or these other characters from Portland that are involved, but there's also roots there in the players, in the performance, and contributors to the piece. And so while we didn't have a lot of money, and never do, and Will had brought resources, and you all had brought resources, and all the people and institutions here, we did have space, time, people, a Portland summer, roast chicken, wine, all the things that allow something to germinate. And so there is a photo up here that is from, another residency that he had along with the performers in 2021, where they started to test out the stop animation, which I think also happened at the Momentary, this like early, let's pull some things from the pica storage and tack up a green screen. Will just told us, DIY style, and start testing this idea, which I think came from studying images and also thinking about erasure and all of the things that green screen could represent, especially on Black bodies, and thinking about dance and how it's recorded and remembered. And so when I think about this group, I think, well, there's all of this recording and memory and how the piece came about. We couldn't have thought about the pandemic or any of the other things that elongated the process, but what resulted is basically everybody committing over the long haul to see it happen.
So in regards to the Momentary in Crystal Bridges, Will joined us in residence. He was one of our first artists in residence in 2019, and that's where he started working partially on the stop motion. And then when I inherited this project quite joyfully in 2021 when Pia left. And there was this moment at the Momentary, so the Momentary is in Bentonville, Arkansas. It opened in 2020. It was founded as a contemporary art space where performing arts, visual arts, and culinary arts were all on equal footing. And I think what makes Siccer and Will's work so important within the context of the Momentary, it's an industrial space, it's an old craft cheese factory, and it was really founded in terms of thinking about how all of these different practices overlap and how all of these different methodologies come together in these shared spaces. And so when we had the opportunity to start thinking about a production residency and the really unique spaces that we hold, it was a really exciting time to work with Will. And then fast forward a little bit to when we were able to premiere the work. One thing that was exciting was typically the performance schedule and the exhibition schedule are on very different timelines, but as luck would have it, with the transitions that were happening within the Momentary, there was like a really big, nice open gallery space in that timeline. So we were able to kind of like build out a plan where the actual installation opened almost 2 months, a month and a half before the performance. And then, again, because of the way things fell, we were able to have the show open for almost like 8 or 9 months. So way before and then way after the performance. Oh, and then the MCA.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking as you were talking, I mean, I was at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago at the time, and I came to a dress rehearsal at the Momentary. Was it a dress or a show? Maybe I came to both. I can't remember. Anyway, so I got to see it on that stage, like, I don't know, the week or 2 weeks before it came to MCA, but we had a similar issue of being inside of a visual art, primarily a visual art institution, truly, in the sense of a contemporary art museum. And instead of a large gallery, what we got was a stairwell. So we had the opposite problem because of the difference in performance timelines. And I don't know, there's some images cycling through it, and it ended up being really beautiful, but it's like one monitor and some pieces of green fabric, So compared to what's here and what was at the Momentary and what was at Pica, it was a really different monster, and somehow incredibly difficult still to put up and make happen. Yeah.
Do you remember the conversations we were having around the fact that both the works were on display at the same time?
Yeah. No, I don't.
I
remember doing that.
I don't think we came to a conclusion of what that meant.
We thought maybe there would be something cool that would happen. I think I sort of tried to see inside of my then institution what kind of partnership might happen, and it just nothing really went anywhere. So I don't know what would have happened. Like, I don't know who is like paying attention to what's going on in Bentonville and Chicago at the same time. It's sort of a strange Midwest configuration. Besides the two of us. But there was something intriguing about that, and there's always all of these threads that feel like they could get picked up that just can't be in the practicality of the thing. But they are, to me, just as much a part of it in some way. And like one thing that became really clear to me when I got to see the stage performance in Arkansas was just the difference between our two theaters. MCA Chicago is fairly unique nationally because there's a few others that are sort of similar, but really small number of spaces that are kind of a museum, like truly a contemporary art center of some kind that have actually a traditional proscenium theater that is made for performance, not for like art talks. Like, it is made for the performing arts. And so, it's among institutions that were sort of founded in the late 60s, and then in the 90s when they actually were really institutionalizing in a constructed building kind of way, a theater was built, and the idea was that performance had always been part of the museum. Let's install an actual performance space. And of course, there was a very particular idea of what that was in 1996, right? That is maybe different than what we would build now in 2025, or in 2021 or 23, whatever, whatever year. This is the magic of this project. Is I've been talking about it with Will since 2019, I think, and involved in Will's work in other ways since 2015 or 16 maybe. So I think, yeah. But anyway, seeing the Bentonville performance, that theater is a much smaller rake than the MCA theater. And I think we had already sort of decided there's a way that at MCA we can build out the stage so that it really just touches the first row rather than dropping off and then spiking back up again with seats. And I had a moment of panic where I was like, do we need to build out the stage, which is like a 2-day process that costs $1,500, which would have been a decision I'd make like a week before. And then I was like, I think I had a brief chat with Will about just thinking about sightlines. And we ended up blocking, because of the rake, the combination of the rake and the drop-off on our stage when it's not built out, there's this sort of first 3 or 4 rows that is below stage level. And so we ended up, I think, blocking off those rows. And also, just because Chicago was still recovering and probably still is from pandemic drop-off in theater attendance. Also, some of the back rows I think we blocked off as well to get people into the ideal zone of sight, because the stage piece is part of the piece is so. I don't know. The horizon line feels really important in it, and the relationship of the camera that is on stage to the dancers. And there's so much detailed sound that's happening, and some of it is mic'd, and some of it is mic'd at different levels, and some of it feels unmic'd, So that kind of thread of just being able to kind of take the time to witness how the show was progressing over the different institutions really was a game changer, actually, in those small ways, those small little minutia that you can adjust to in the moment or in that week of panic. Yeah, I don't know how I ended up there, but now we're there.
I was going to say something about things that people have mentioned, and also seeing the piece here and thinking about our conversations with Will about architecture and this idea of this stacked space, or what the theater looks like, or if there's a visual art space. And I was struck today going into an installation I know very well, the evolution of it, was built out at Pica after being in Bentonville and MCA, and it's arrived here, that I was like, oh, this is a full performance. And the performance was a film and a play and a dance, and they've started to collapse, and it's so iterative, and it will continue to develop. And it's hard to define what it is, because we've seen the different iterations, and now they are becoming a whole other thing, a whole other machine of material. And this piece in there is equally a sound piece as much as it is everything else. So it's sensorial, all of it. I saw it at MCA. And so for me, that experience was like looking into like a camera frame, which is referenced so many times in the dance itself and inside of this piece, like the mechanics of things and how flexible this piece has been to architecture and responsive to it. And also the conditions of like oppression and change and, you know, all the political things that are evident in the work as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in there. As kind of the only, not one of the OG commissioners, I feel like we've been so blessed at ICLA to benefit from all of this labor and work of you and your institutions and these kinds of negotiations to get to a place where we can present the work in the way that it's presented here, only for it to hopefully unravel and change again where it goes next at the kitchen or elsewhere. But I feel like maybe just to share from like ICLA's own kind of coming into this kind of relationship with you all and certainly with Will and the work, when I joined ICLA about 2.5 years ago, you know, Anne and I were talking about kind of artists who I'd want to like pitch to do a project with, and I was a huge fan of Will's work. I think everyone up here is, and has followed it in its various forms, from you as a dancer yourself and other artists' works to your own practice. And you know, I remember it was like 2023. It was maybe. I don't remember exactly when it was, but you had just come from like the East Coast. You hadn't yet moved to LA. We like met on a table over here. We were installing our shows. And I was like, I'd really love to talk with you about doing a project. And doing a project here. And it started from like just, I had seen, you know, in the pandemic 2021, had seen Everlasting Stranger at the Henry Art Gallery, which not a lot of people got to see, you know, the plight of the pandemic. But I think, you know, I was so struck by also seeing an artist practice get kind of be held by an institution in that way, and kind of the ways in which you were experimenting within video, with screen printing, like these other forms that came up, and just felt like, you know, I would love to kind of like unpack that with you through a larger show. And then when we started talking with this invitation, it was really you, Will, who was like, no, we have to present siccer and we have to bring siccer to LA. And I was like, hasn't this been presented? And it was like, really, you know, I was like, I don't know, I feel like we should do something. And it was like, no, you know, and that's really from our conversations of understanding like the intention for this work to be held and carried in different institutional contexts and forms. And I feel like, you know, ICLA has an incredible longstanding history of supporting performance and durational practice. Two artists in this audience, Simon Lung and Carmen Argote, who have both performed in this space and exhibited in this space, and can speak to that too more recently. But, you know, so it made a lot of sense to be like engaging an artist like Will, who, you know, bends all the genres of dance and art and music and writing and choreography and curation in all its ways. And so it made a lot of sense to kind of extend that invitation. And I think once we decided to present siccer, there was like a month left of the show at Pica. And I wrote to Kristan and I was like, I'm coming. I came on the last day of the show. It was being photographed for like final documentation. It's pouring rain. And I just spent the whole day at Pica. And, you know, you and your team were so generous. Urte especially, working on the kind of technical side of things and installation components. And I just, you know, I could feel also in that was our first time meeting, you know, my first time at Pica, but could feel this real, like, sincere appreciation and understanding of of Will's practice and how it could, translate to other spaces. And so it was really through that experience that we were able to kind of looking at these iterations from the Momentary to the MCA Chicago to PICA of like, okay, what would it look like to present it here? And to kind of engage with ICLA spaces. Then it became, okay, we need to find a partner for the performance because, while we are as an institution really committed to performance, I think the ways in which it's manifests here, and I would say like committed to presenting dance, but how and the ways in which we can are limited by our institution. That has, it doesn't have a dance floor, doesn't have a stage, this is it. And so this didn't, wasn't really the ideal conditions for presenting siccer, for those who saw it at REDCAT would know. And it was then that we started to kind of look at spaces and talk to folks. And REDCAT was always kind of for you, Will, like the space for it to be presented at. And I think it took us some time to get there. Prior to Katy joining REDCAT, it was kind of like we were in conversations with them about presenting the work. And then when Katy arrived, it was like full circle, we have to do it. And I have to shout out Pete Galindo, who's here recording, who helped to like in that interim period really like make it possible for siccer to be on the REDCAT calendar. So when Katy arrived, it was like, okay, we're gonna do this. And so, I feel like maybe one more thing to say about ICLA, but you've all heard me talk about this show so often, so I'm not to take up space, but just to say, like, I think one of the things as maybe an arts institution that's kind of joining this later in the game, I think what we saw as our role too, and what I felt like as a curator was like, okay, how to hold and foster a space for this project, but also to support, like to compile all the materials that we need and that you need, Will, to be able to kind of present the project elsewhere in the future, for it to be collected, for it to be represented. And so like, I feel like because of all the work that came before it in this incredible roller coaster of a journey, the siccer journey that we're all on, I feel like that's then, created the pathway for us to say as an institution, what can we bring to this conversation? And it is like this opportunity to look back and to reflect, and the opportunity to kind of present it in the fullness that you see here.
Thank you all so much. That was fascinating. I think I'm going to pull us back a little bit and look with a slightly wider lens onto the field and to working with performance in museum and visual arts spaces, and then we'll sort of come back to the project more specifically, and we might pull Will into the conversation, maybe, just maybe. And also I want to touch on the topic tonight of the curatorial role specifically. So I'm going to ask a few questions, a couple of questions, and I don't think we have time for everyone to answer every question. So I'm going to let you guys maybe duke it out with who wants to respond. But in thinking about how visual arts organizations, including museums, but not exclusively museums, have supported or not maybe sufficiently supported the work of artists who are working with performance, I would just love to hear thoughts about that. It does feel like I'm always reticent about these kinds of claims that in the last 10 or 15 years, more museums are interested in performance. I think that's partially true, and also it's also true that we have a long history of artists working in performance and all other disciplines interfacing with visual artists, and that goes back many, many decades. So it's really not new, but it maybe is different. And so thinking a bit about that and how that has all sort of shifted institutions in some hopefully fundamental way. And then last part of that question is how working with Will specifically and working with siccer deepened your engagement or your institution's engagement and commitment to performance. Was this project transformative in some way in how the institution thought about both the care of this work, but also how they might think about it going forward. Anyone intrigued by that question, Tara?
I'll start. This was the second to last project I did. It was part of the final set of projects I did in my time at the MCA, and so I think I was really purposefully strategic about picking a set. It was part of a series called Frictions. There was a theme. I won't go into all of that, but I was very strategic about picking a set of projects that together and individually would plug into different aspects of how the performance program at MCA, I thought at the time, needed to be nudged, but also would sort of hold down what it had been, like build on its existing reputation. Part of that was because we were sort of emerging back into live space. You know, this is 2023 when it was actually happening, and so that means we're building it through 21 and 22 basically, but like 21 was a little iffy, like what's that, like will we be doing shows? I don't know. And so, you know, it was all sort of under that COVID context of not, you know, it was changing every like 2 months, if not faster, like how much work it literally took to get people into a room, right? And so I think so the thing about having that really purposeful performing arts theater inside of the MCA, which is amazing, it's a beautiful theater and I love it very deeply, is that then it institutionalized each of the disciplines into separate spaces in the building. And so that was that has been, you know, MCA, like I said, has this reputation for doing performance, which I think had to remind people of a lot, actually, internally sometimes. But I think there was a way that we were working to chip away at while still retaining the I'm a theater nerd. Like, I love a theater. I love a dark room, you know? Like, it wasn't at all, I'll choose, if I have to choose, I'll choose a theater over a gallery personally for myself. But like, if I'm inside of this institution that is going to inherently, just because of its mission, put the gallery spaces forefront in the minds of the staff, I want to hold down the vitality and crucialness of that theater space and also expand beyond it. And so Will was one of a couple artists in that set of 3 who really were purposefully trying to work in relation to a deep performance-specific lineage and a performing arts-specific lineage for those that care about that distinction. I don't care that much about it, but I know it is a real one in economic ways. And also working with video installation, working outside of the gallery, and I say outside of the gallery intentionally because we weren't really able to use a gallery because our timelines were more like 18 months rather than 4 years, which is how long it takes to put on a small exhibition at the MCA. So, we were able to finagle certain public spaces, and so there was the small stairwell that Will's work was in, and also another video installation that was in a larger stairwell at the bottom of a larger stairwell, and both of those spaces were right in the sort of first floor theater the entrance of the MCA that is right in front of the theater, which is the entrance no one knows exists. There's also the restaurant there, thankfully now, which is only several years old. So it is becoming this sort of vital space. So it became partly about trying to think about the way that audiences use the building, just as much as how audiences intersect across performance and visual art, like their interests or aesthetic curiosities. The other reality of having a theater and a lot of the history of the performance in the last 25 years in an institution being inside of that specific space primarily is that there's different time frames. So the visual art audience is there in the daytime during museum hours, and there might be like a Tuesday every month or every week where it's open till 9 or whatever, but mostly people are there in the daytime, and then the shows are at night, and you might have a matinee that everyone's like, oh my God, I forgot there's a show in the theater, right, it's at 2 p.m. So there's that kind of weird dynamic that happens. And so there's not pictures of it, but the room at the top of the stairs is this common space in the museum oh my God, amazing timing. Sorry, I'm talking for so long, but So behind us, if you can imagine, there's a big room with these plants on the ceiling that are not related to Will, though they match really well. There was also a wall where we had like a video screen with all 3 artists in the series talking about their work, and a big wall text with the theme and that kind of, sort of interpretive material. As well as wall texts at every point you might encounter one of those 2 video works. So it was partly about getting the people who show up in the daytime to come down and ask about what's happening at night. Not only, like physically they have to go down to find out more about it. And the people that are coming in at night to like wander up and watch that video and experience that interpretive work. And then there's like a third audience that's just like people who go to the cafe or the restaurant, right? Who are like being disrupted by this. That stairwell is like right in the cafe also, which you can't tell from the photos. But, so there was this intense sound that rises from the video occasionally, and, and it was also complicated in terms of just the workers in that space. But, it's like, so then there's this question of like, how do you get those people to know about the video installation, ask about that, and then wonder about what's going to happen in the theater at 7:30. So just to name the kind of temporal as well as spatial like axes that I think those kinds of interdisciplinary spaces really demand us to think about, and which they have not been built in a way or used previously in a way that is thinking through those things very often. And so every performance project is an instance of attempting to create a precedent for a future one. So I hope that Frictions and Siccer was a precedent for those public spaces being used for. It was actually the first installation in that stairwell that Will did. I mean, we had like a performance thing there before, but yeah. So it was quite special.
I think that's the subversion, the curatorial subversion. In between maybe our practices. I'm technically the visual art curator at PICA. I'm always on panels and in rooms with performance curators. I feel very at home with performance curators and producers because it's about like how to build a space as well and an idea, and we're dealing with time. And my partner at PICA, Erin Boberg-Doughton, is the performing arts curator and my co-artistic director, and we have worked collaboratively since we were in our 20s. I won't say how old we are now, and have never had a wall between our departments or each other. And so the kind of flow of how these projects happen or the artists we're interested in starts to bleed together. So this project, it could have been Erin and I fighting over who gets to work with Will. But we were like, wait, the material of this exists in both of our realms. Like, what is the possibility here? And I had been having conversations with Will about his life as a visual artist and how that work is seen and interpreted through that mechanism. And so often in our institutions, maybe not so much at PICA, but at others, it's about economies and about, and the market, as we know, drives visual art institutions and museums. So places like the ICA or PICA or other kind of places that are non-collecting institutions become really important in pushing against that model. And so the subversion was like, let's give equal weight to both of these things. And let's also do it in a space that doesn't have like a really built out theater or a really built out visual art space so they can bleed into each other. But it was still based on the learnings from everybody else who had produced it through the lens of performance. And you can see the exhibition is very informed by that in terms of its design at all of the spaces, even the stairwell space. Like the use of how it would happen would maybe puzzle preparators, but it wouldn't puzzle theater technicians who are like, okay, here's how we're gonna present this, front face it to an audience in this space.
That's a great segue because I even, this kind of categorization, are you a visual arts curator? Are you a performance arts curator? And of course, in large institutions, we can go a lot further. Are you the curator of architecture and design, the curator of painting and sculpture, which is a dumb category to begin with, the curator of drawings and works on paper, etc. So my question for all of you is, have you always, as curators of contemporary art, worked with performance in some capacity? And could you speak to the ways in which your role as a curator, because every way that we work in terms of the methodology of the exhibition, of course, is going to change our role a little bit, but specifically thinking about working with performance and with an artist like Will, or working with Will, how is that different than a different kind of exhibition?
Okay, well, I'll start. So I come to curating through my artistic practice. So I have a practice. I studied visual art, photography specifically, and started making performance after I graduated my undergrad. And I came into curating because I saw the need to find more people like myself, and also people to witness what I was doing. I was living in Arkansas, and so a friend and I started a festival, and that's kind of how I figured out that I really enjoyed curating. So I've always been a performance curator, so much so that at one point I asked myself, wait, do I know how to curate objects? So I started a series on my bookshelf. It was a very fun pandemic activity. Turns out I was like curating ice and still very time-based materials. Anyway, the thing that really excited me about Will's practice and other artists like Will, who are pushing every element and the boundaries of the different categories, was that I could start to make the case within my institution that performance just doesn't belong on, or like only shouldn't just live on the stage, but that it should live in the gallery, and that it can actually live in both spaces at the same time, and that there's more to discuss rather than, like, I think often we're dealing with structures and categories just that within the institution that just make things easier, but really aren't ever the way that the artists are working. And so I guess it became really exciting for me to work with Will, because it was an opportunity to prove with someone with like such amazing rigor and such an amazing project that we could do both and be successful.
Yeah, when I came to the kitchen, I had been curating exhibitions only for about, I think, 7 years. And it was a huge challenge for me to, take on this incredible history of performance that the kitchen had, cultivated in New York for 40 years. And so everything I learned about curating performance came directly from working with these legendary artists that came through this institution. And it really, to me, I don't even know if I would still be curating if I hadn't intersected with performance in that way, because it really shifted the way that I look at collaboration. It allowed me to take so many more risks in making exhibitions, and also just made me think so much more about the audience and a certain generosity that exhibitions could offer. And I think that the kitchen is a very special place in that there are no distinctions, within the curators between, can you work in the theater, can you work in the gallery, do you work with dance, do you work with theater or music or exhibitions, and it all kind of blends together, and it's really artist specific. And through that experience, I think I came in, with a very specific idea of what a curator does. And it really, a curator really shapes these ideas with the artists. And then, through this work with performance, I was like, okay, there are times when I really step back and I'm just a producer. Or like sometimes I step back, I'm not even a producer, I'm just the person who's here to sell the tickets and like make sure there's water in the dressing room. It's like I'm doing so little in a way. I'm just like making sure the show goes on. And I think with Will, it was really interesting because I think, in my mind, Will came in as a performer, or like someone who worked in the theater, and that's a position in which I would take really a step back and really be like, okay, this is a lead artist who has these established relationships with these dancers or these other artists, these deep collaboration, and I'm kind of here on the outside to listen and maybe have a little bit of input, but the lead artist in a performance is really shaping the project. But then I think Will was constantly pushing, being like, just act like a regular curator who has ideas to share, and don't be afraid to, voice your real opinions. So thank you, Will, for pushing back on that and be like, no, I actually want to hear what you would say to an artist in the gallery, because I am an artist in the gallery.
Yeah, I feel like it was so fun to install with you, Will, and to be in the galleries with you. I feel like there is a different, as someone who is a dancer, is a choreographer, has worked across the stage and the gallery in the way that you have. I think, my experience working on siccer was very much I know that so many decisions had already been made before the work got here, and then it was like, oh no, that can change, or we'll figure it out when we get in on site. But yeah, I think kind of navigating to your point, Lumi, of this kind of role of often as curator, and then I were talking about this a little bit earlier, curator, you assume this role of you're the director, you're making the decisions. And even when you're, working with living artists, there's still this kind of dependency. And I found that, in working with you, Will, it was it felt like a true collaboration. And it felt also I learned so much of just kind of things and sensibilities that you have from working in a theater setting that then could translate into the gallery setting. And, just even from something like the amount of time, that you spent just in determining the hanging of the screens, right? It's like a performance in and of itself, it's you have our art handlers who are slight adjustments and things like that. But I would say there is a different, when you're working with living artists more broadly, but certainly artists who work in performance, there's this element of trust in stepping into this unknown. And I think you seeing that generosity that you gave, Will, to the dancers as there is a choreography, there is, a script, but there's also agency in that script. And I feel within a project that was kind of, cooked a little bit by the time that we're working together, but I felt there was so much generosity with me and with our institution of entering that script. So, and I think that doesn't always happen when working with living artists outside of performance.
I'm going to direct a question to Will now, and then I promise we'll open it up to all of you. As we've been discussing, this is a project that, in addition to Will, has 5 dancers that Will has worked with from the beginning. And one of the really beautiful and also logistically challenging things is it has to be those 5 dancers every time this work is presented. And as you've all gathered from the conversation, there's the installation and then there's the performance. And when Will kept saying to us, you have to do both, the work is both, fully respecting that, it wasn't until I experienced the performance that I truly understood what he was saying and why that was absolutely vital to the project. And that can vary. In our case, obviously, the installation is here, the performances took place at REDCAT. Those 2 things could happen in the same building. And yet, this presents real challenges to museum schedules, because Will has to first find out, is he available, and then are his 5 dancers available? And, we ended up postponing our show by almost a year because they actually weren't available. And I know there have been, as I said even earlier, there's been children born and life continues. So I think, one question for you, Will, is simply that your way of working with people, with individuals who you see as having very, very distinct contributions to the work that you want to make, means that they can't just be replaced with the next dancer. But also, in thinking of the longevity of this piece, how do you imagine 20 years from now, when those 5 dancers certainly are not available, does the work never get performed? We were talking about this a little bit earlier. Can the video installation be acquired by MoMA, as it should be, and extricated from the performance? Would you ever be comfortable with that? And just how do you think of that long term? And how did you come to the decision in the first place that you would only present the work with those 5 dancers as many times as you can make it happen?
I think the answer is one that would ideally. Well, thank you, first of all, just for tonight. It's very moving to have you all together. It's such a long journey for the project. And each phase has been so formative to the work itself. So it's very exciting to be able to talk about it all at the same time. Yeah, the answer, I think, would span like 7 years of kind of thinking of this question. I think that I'm not remembering the question as well as you stated it, but I think that starting from the end of the question, I don't know yet if the installation can be presented separate from those 5 performers being available, because it's a project that I've never experienced in the way that it really is a project of survival. It's a project that tells the story of like this sort of infrastructural, curatorial, career-based life intervention, children. No one in the none of the performers or I live in the same city that we lived in when we started the project in 2018, except for one person. And I think many of you, that's also similar, that none of you have the same jobs, the same institutions. Just to come back to Katy, who was the first person who kind of planted the seed for the project. Katy was at the Kitchen in 2017, has since been to Philly and London, and then ended up at REDCAT, where Anne and Amanda reached out to her and say, hey, would you present this project named Siccer? And she was the first person to, yeah. But so, yeah, I don't know yet. I know that if it gets acquired, there will be a kind of like financial breakdown where the performers get dividends from that acquisition, because without their bodies, the work couldn't exist. But beyond that, there is this question of the way in which seeing these people, like in this image on the screen and there, what they are performing in relationship to the camera and the situation and the trap and the predicament of being captured and circulated and decontextualized as Black bodies, as performers, and the kind of thematizing of that. And the expansion of that into that all of that sort of needs to be there in order to kind of fully understand the scope of the questions of the project and the ethics of the project. So I don't know what could be done without them there. So when we talk about score-based performance, I come from this sort of Judson lineage, and this Fluxus lineage where anyone as Yoko Ono can light a match and wait till it burns out, and then that's a score. But my work has been really about how can you work with a score-based performance practice that allows for a lot of room for. Well, also curators. I feel like the score for each institution is so different, and that's what's exciting to me, is actually kind of bending ways that the institution can accommodate these questions that are unanswerable, that performance brings up in a way that's really exciting to me. But yeah, how might I don't know. I don't really have a great finishing to that question.
Can I
but
jump in, Will?
Yeah, please.
I think one thing that we haven't touched on that I think Will does within the ethic, but also some of the content of the piece, is also in using these same 5, like pushes against this sense, particularly in dance, of like, we'll just recast. Like, you got injured, you got pregnant, okay, great. Somebody's in the wings, ready to take your place. And I think Will, from the beginning, has always seen the primacy of the individual, and frankly, the primacy of each of our institutions. Even though there are many of us here, they've all been so individual. And I think from the beginning, you've really thought with Rebecca and other studio managers of like, what's an institution of the Will Rawls studio? You know, you put your dancers on insurance, which is very hard and very rare in this economy. You took care of them in the midst of the pandemic when many people did not have access to committed resource. I think it would be totally reasonable, and I think we've all worked with artists who, when faced with a totally reasonable moment like the kitchen, where they're like, oh, we need to, change our architecture, you gotta wait, that the artist might say, oh, great, well, actually it's a solo project now. Does that mean I can present it sooner? And you really stuck to your commitment. And I think in doing so, pushed us as institutions as well to rethink our contracting structure, our relationship to cancellation, our per diem structure. Even we had a really formative meeting with the ICA and REDCAT to think about like, what does partnership look like to ensure equitable payment? And like time, we had a rehearsal week with you here. We needed to make sure that people really had like a wage that made sense for them. So I think you're doing that within the structure of performing arts as much as you're doing that within the structure of visual arts.
Do you have any questions? Carmen, of course, has a question. Carmen always has a question. I just want to say that we are also open to Will asking questions, panelists asking each other questions, panelists asking Will questions, or any iteration thereof. Carmen.
Oh, thank you. This is amazing. I'm like my mind is just like all these connections. But I like the idea of like protest kind of comes to mind, and then family also, and the relationships between. I'll start with family because that was the first one that kind of came to mind, and like we have different. Like when there's a family, like a family of performers, a family, like what are the these, you're like in it for life in this way, and whether that's the life of the work or the life of the, like these like relationships, and the stakes are different than, let's say, like, okay, like I'm gonna recast, or I'm gonna just like, just kind of move and through these different things, and within that kind of relationship to the word that I keep using is family because that's the only word that I can kind of find. Then it becomes an act of protest within this larger system. And so, I mean, how do you think about? I mean, I'm like asking Will, how do you think about family, and how does that? I mean, anybody can answer it, but it's really and protest together in the work, especially when. It goes into these institutions and you're like, hey, it's my family. I mean, that's like a different relationship. I mean, we're not compromising because this is the family, and this is, and within that action, then there's protest, and there's like a catalyst for like transformation there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the pandemic showed me that there are all these things that I wasn't considering as part of the performer's labor that then got brought up when many of their gigs were canceled, and I was like, let's keep doing this project. So what does that mean in terms of making sure that every dollar I promised you should be, gets to you, and then even if the gig is canceled, and then raising money, on top of that, because I want you to be here. So I want to make sure that that I'm doing everything I can do. So then to make sure that you feel compensated in this time of like extreme, destitution in the performance field, like this is 2020, 2021. And then am then given a kind of set of like detailed needs and desires and like labor protocols and ethical questions to bring to curators to then have them think about what it means to ask a performance to happen in a pandemic. Is the pandemic over? When is, all these questions could not be brought to them. And then it's like then pushing them to then talk to their institution. So I feel like it's like a project that relies on human life is heavy. It can't be, there's only and it's heavy in a beautiful way, which might slow it down, but also makes it feel tangible to everyone who gets to touch it, because there's room for people to enter, because these are like questions about human life and care and well-being and time and what feels valuable, and reprioritizing things based on what's available in the institution, and reprioritizing things based on any other, the things that the curators want to learn about, their own curatorial practice in relationship to the project. And so protest, I definitely think about it as resistance. I think it was like a slow drag. You know what I mean? That like this project is about the things that extended beyond imagining in time because of the arrival of the COVID-19 virus and how that kind of obliterated and shattered like our sense of time in general. So I think this project kind of insists on acknowledging that time in some way, shape, or form. It does in its content, but then I think also in the way it's like a slice of all of our lives at this point in this really crazy way. And then the other process in family. I think for family, it's like, I would love to get rid of some of my family members sometimes, but you can't. And so it makes you stronger. And what if you are then required to put these family members on stage, every time, you have this reunion called siccer? What do you need to build into the performance practices themselves to allow this person who might resent you for not being able to do what you just can't do as a human being, which might be any number of things in their life, but that they have said yes and you've said yes to being in the room together to kind of deliver this project. And that really became the bulk of the work, and then making sure that the performance can like expand and contract around that emotionality, around that unanswerable need, and still create something that other people who don't have this backlog of stories and needs and resentments and resolutions can still get inside of.
I was going to say it's in the title. Also, this idea of like, when you talked about sicker, like being sicker from the like slang thing, like we're just gonna get like wild and free, but also sick, we're gonna like correct things or they're gonna change. And I think we're all in the business of curating people, even those of us who have curated exhibitions. It hasn't, I don't think, started with an object. It started with that question, Katy, that you were answering about like, what do you need? What do you want to do next? And that's a certain ethic within art practice, contemporary art, not a genre, that we are all pushing. And so when you have matching pictures with an artist who is also making those things happen within their practice, with their colleagues, there becomes a inherent contract to make good on that thing that you're trying to do. And it's not easy. But I'll say back to your question about how has it changed things in the institutions, I think that you're right, that whole period did, because we all had to act differently. But I'll say that like in the long, slow drag, that is something that's now like a part of how we do projects. We plan for it to go on longer, to have to care for people for a longer amount of time, to bring other people into the project that we might not have known about, to change, to maybe move the date. Like even if it's published, be like, sorry, this thing happened. And to not let the kind of like bizarre institutional perfectionism, which we know is a sickness in itself, take over the project, right? And so in this case, we've all had to work within and against our own institutions, or collaborate, or change as we went on?
I mean, I think that, one thing that sort of is thinking, going back to this moment when the exhibition of Siccer was both at the Momentary and at the MCA Chicago, and that I couldn't think about another exhibition that was happening at two institutions at the same time. And it just happened because they were premiered close together, and there were all these various calendars that overlap. But like, there's never been a conversation about this cross-institutional thing where two different museums agreed to present the same artwork with the same title that looks completely different in each place. Like, that's just like something that just never got talked about because it wasn't, there was not bandwidth and institutional, impetus to kind of foreground that, but it also happened at PICA and on the boards in the same way. So that's just like a thing for art history that I'm kind of interested in thinking about for the future. But yeah.
I think performance is often the thing that pushes that. Like, there is one precedent, which is Common Time, which is the Merce Cunningham exhibition that was at the MCA and at the Walker simultaneously. And there were some things that were shown, particularly video works, in both places. And there were some things like artifacts, like costumes or single print photographs that were only in one place. But that was huge in that moment. And I toured a different dance piece with a different set of choreographers that went from one institution to the next. And I think it really speaks to the way performance continues to push the institution in its conception of time with the use of the body that can't be in two places at once, but can trouble our sense of grounding. So I think performance is really effective and super important in doing that.
Thanks, everyone. This has been very fruitful and chewy and deep. I'm digesting and processing the work itself and the kind of lineage and passage that the work has been through all the institutions and iterations. And one thing that stands out to me is hearing this kind of elasticity of like an ecosystem in your work between the forms that you work in, and how that then traveled through each of the institutions and created a very live call and response in the curation and also the institutional bending. And there's just the language that has been used, like collapsing and bleeding and bending. And so, yeah, it kind of feels both like an ecosystem at work and then at the same time planetary, because even the full circle of like it's starting with Katy in the kitchen and then literally circling back to, we need a performance space in LA. So anyways, it's just really a lot to digest, and it's very exciting. And I guess I'm wondering how with all the iterations, maybe how you've learned through this lineage of institutions, and also how you all have learned from each other. So that's obviously a very big question, but if anyone has any sparks of like being inside of that call and response, how has it kind of expanded your ecosystem of processing and curating?
Maybe I could say something. I would say, to Katy's point of, what, we're talking a lot about how we're pushing the institutions or our understandings of these disciplines, and how your work has like offered us that opportunity. And what you shared, Katy, of just kind of, Will, how you've, there are these certain ways in which you've, created an infrastructure for dance to be presented in the like theater and gallery settings simultaneously and presented together. And I feel like there are so many artists working in performance that I wish could like, learn from you of just like, I feel like, and how you've held the dancers as the lead artists for this, of how you held them coming in and saying like, these are non-negotiables for that. And I think within an industry, within like certain institutions like our own, that are still learning how to present this work and how to work with performance. I mean, the temporality is different. We had kind of shared a little bit in our pre-meeting chat of, like the same budget for a 5-month exhibition could, is the cost for a 3-day performance. And we have to be able to like talk about elasticity. Like, how can we rethink even the temporality of exhibitions themselves so that we're not like shoehorning a small budget for something so that it can happen in those 3 days, or, it's just like forcing us to think about time differently and the time for exhibitions differently, and then the honoring of that time and labor through artists who are kind of bringing recognition to that. I think that like, I'm so excited for the kind of like moment that we're at in the field, or like just thinking of all of us here on stage. I mean, like, and the work that all of you, I'm like so inspired by the work that so many of you have done around performance, and to think about like, like how do we actually make those flips so that we're not just like making our accommodating performance in a space that was never built for that, and instead building new frameworks to like understand exhibitions, exhibition models, curatorial models, collaborative models, funding models. I mean, something that Kristan brought up yesterday of like, how much of your own individual, money went into this. I mean, there's very few projects that have this many institutions on board and yet still are not able to support it to its full extent. And so I think like, that takes a lot on you, Will, of fundraising for yourself, grant, right? I mean, I love the litany of grant writing, grants that you've received and haven't that came up in the performance. But I think that's also really interesting because it's like, while the credit line for this show is a novel, I think it's also, a lot of that is because of the work that you've done to create that. And so, like, yeah, while it should be something to celebrate that all of us are here too, I think it's like we're also fighting for like this network of support to kind of be, like to build this greater foundation for it. So just wanted to share that.
What number are you at in the grant? I didn't see the most recent performance, so I don't know what number.
I mean, technically, I think it's even gone up since the REDCAT shows a few weeks ago. I think I've applied for like 20 grants for this project.
Only like 3 that you didn't get.
Yeah, I think I've gotten like 12 now. 1 is pending, and I think 7 I didn't get. But yeah, what's cool about the ICA too is that it's the only city that the project has presented where I live. So there's all these programs that can happen around the different layers of the project, which has been kind of a cool new thing about being here.
How are we feeling? Ready for a drink or something? Some food? If there's one last question, we can do that, or we can just... Okay, one last question. I knew you were going to ask a question.
I wasn't sure if I was going to ask a question, but since we're talking about sort of like institutional critique and expanding frameworks, and this is a non-collecting institution, so maybe this is a question for curators who have worked in collecting institutions, if any of you have, but particularly for Will, in terms of your conceptualization for this piece and its many lives and iterations. Have you thought about it being collected and what that would look like structurally?
I've thought about it being collected, but I don't know what that looks like. I just know that like I would pay the performers some dividend of the fee. There's many because it also means that like in collecting a work, there has to be some guarantee that what you agree is being collected is what it will look like in 40 years when I'm dead, and like what, so, and I don't yet know what that, actually the show that's happening in New York, I have to redesign the installation. So this is the last time that the installation currently will be seen in this way, an 80-foot wall projection in the kitchen, which is currently housed at the West Beth Art Center, will be like a 2-screen, like totally different, like in a 20-foot by 10-foot space. Like it'll be a totally compressed transformation of the work. So what's the final version that I'm going to agree to be collected for history? I don't know. I mean, I think I feel really happy with all the versions of it because they were all real to me at the time. I mostly have like a financial idea of what that should look like, but not actually the protocols of what the details are of what the installation will look like eventually. If you have suggestions, yeah.
Is it important to you that there is a single version that feels resolved, or are you more interested in building in flexibility to the work?
I mean, I think it would make sense to me. I mean, that there is some sort of score involved with sort of like giving people who are, alive when I am not, who are thinking through these questions, if they're still relevant then, who have the opportunity to make certain choices about, there are fundamental materials and objects and images that have to happen, but I'm more interested in kind of leaving a choreography to be collected, than just the object as a static thing.
Thanks to our panelists. You guys are awesome. Thank you all for coming. And thanks again to Will for such an extraordinary work. Good night and get home safe.